Hi, everyone. As you may know, today's presentation will be the last in our Toxicology and Society's The Impacts of Chemicals in Our Lives speaker series. My co-host, Tracy Collier, and I, Tracy.
Hi.
Hi. We started this series with a strong conviction that as a community, we need to have more conversations about all the ways that chemicals impact us. We started the series 5 years ago, which is pretty amazing, as a way to hold space for those conversations. Today is our 43rd and final presentation. We're proud of all the ways that we've considered what chemicals do to us. And we're also proud of the range of expertise and caliber of presenters that we've had over the years. Thank you so much for being part of our journey. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Tracy.
Okay, Ruth, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been a long, strange voyage, and it's been great. It's really been super. So I'm going to moderate today for our speakers. Ian is on. Ian Moran is one of our co-hosts. Ian, you can say hi if you're there. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join in expressing our deep respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And as usual, as always, a few logistics. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. Will be muted throughout the presentation, so we will use the Q&A feature to interact. The focus of our speaker series, again, is to provide understandable examples of how events with a toxicological component have consequences to people and society. Today, we are honored to welcome Chris Shuey and Mallory Kataki as our speakers. Chris is a senior environmental health specialist at Southwest Research Information Center in Albuquerque. His academic interests include developing environmental health studies in collaboration with communities, and he's also actively involved in science and policy initiatives aimed at remediating hundreds of abandoned uranium mines in New Mexico and on the Navajo Nation. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from University of New Mexico in public health, and he is going to be joined today by Mallory Kataki, a biologist and artist who co-leads the Research Translation Core of a Superfund program for which Chris leads the Community Engagement Core, and they'll tell you a little bit more about that when they start. Mallory was born into a traditional Zuni family where creativity was a way of life. Her artistic journey began early. Before she could walk, she was already drawing on the walls. She expresses her heritage through painting, pottery, and contemporary art, often using natural pigments gathered from the mesas near her village. She has degrees in biology and studio art, and art, though, is really Mallory's passion. Her work bridges traditional Zuni symbolism with modern expression, telling stories that preserve and celebrate her culture. Chris and Mallory, we welcome you, and we are really looking forward to your presentation to cap off our speaker series. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take it away.
Thank you, Tracy. Let's see. I think that Janine's going to run our slides. So if we could get those up there, I'm going to follow along on my version. Let me see here. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name again is Chris Shuey, and I've been at Southwest Research and Information Center for 44 years. I lead the Community Engagement Core for the UNM Metals Superfund Research Center. Metals stands for Metal Exposure and Toxicity Assessment on Tribal Lands in the Southwest. We have been working on really the impacts of uranium contamination in Navajo and the Pueblo of Laguna and throughout the Southwest on indigenous lands for really the last 40 some years. Specifically in the last 25 years have engaged in a wide variety of population-based public health studies to major exposures and develop risk estimates, which we're going to talk about today. So I'll let Mallory reintroduce herself.
Hi, thanks, Chris, and thank you, Tracy, for that introduction. Mallory Kutakile Shina Hotona Shikut Tona Gahon Chale. I'd like to give my Zuni formal introduction. From Zuni Pueblo, one of the 19 pueblos here in New Mexico. We're on the most western portion of the border of New Mexico, and currently I'm here in Albuquerque on the homelands of several other pueblos, specifically the Sandia Pueblo and Santa Ana Pueblo. As mentioned, I am the Research Translation Core co-lead of the Metals Superfund Center. I also work in various other capacities within the Community Environmental Health Program that actually houses our Superfund Center, and two other centers. Both me and Chris work integrate with all the programs under this umbrella. I'm also currently starting my first year as a master's in public health student at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And yep, art is a passion as well as science, and I'm hoping that I can further help inform the communities that we work with on the research that has taken place, especially risk communication, risk perception, risk management. All these are somewhat, we face, somewhat difficulties, especially in communicating to communities who have different languages and different cultural belief systems and protocols within their communities. So yeah, I'll hand it back over to Chris. Thank you.
So I would like to recognize that this presentation is really the result of contributions from many community members and our colleagues at University of New Mexico and Southwest Research and Information Center. Um, uh, we have been totally devoted to ensuring that people in these impacted communities participate in the various studies. We've done a lot of citizen science over the years. I can say that we've had nearly or more than 50 bilingual community members trained as environmental health researchers. Today we have more than 30 Native Americans on staff in doing these studies and using really indigenous knowledge to inform and build environmental health capacity on the Navajo Nation and the Pueblo of Laguna. So next slide. And some quick acknowledgements. We're grateful for funding from the National Institutes of Health, and specifically the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which funds our Superfund Research Center. This presentation hasn't been reviewed by or approved by those agencies. We're responsible for it. All the human research that we might discuss in this presentation has been approved by the institutional review boards of at UNM and the Navajo Nation, and most recently the Southwest Tribal Institutional Review Board, which oversees human health studies on the Pueblo of Laguna. The community partners, we'll talk about them later, are listed here. We have no conflicts of interest to report. And of course, we, as our land acknowledgement statement indicates, we honor the Pueblo lands on which the main campus of UNM and my office in Albuquerque sit, and we acknowledge our committed relationships with Indigenous people that we work with. Next slide. So we're going to discuss, open up with defining the problem of abandoned mines on Indigenous lands in the Southwest. We want to help people understand differences between Western and Indigenous principles in science. We're going to talk about risk perception in the communities that we work in, largely from examples through our Superfund Research Center. And Mallory is going to review some of the same findings, but through the lens of Indigenous science and art, and how translating these results is important to develop respectful community report backs of findings in Indigenous communities. So I'll turn it over to Mallory for the next slide.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So before we really delve into more about our science and what we do, it's important to teach and to make aware of those listening in out there the differences between the Indigenous worldview and, Western science. You would say there's a slight difference, or well, really actually rather big difference between the way Indigenous people see the world that they live in. Overall, it's basically just the idea of a holistic worldview, that everything is interconnected. There's a cyclical connection to everything in the world. We don't see everything as a straight line. We see everything in the different dimensions of time and space to be interconnected, interrelated. We are related to one another in several ways, and kinship is looked at not only between human beings, but lands, plants, and animals. And this is some great imagery of the Navajo Nation worldview that was shared with us by Nancy Maryboy and David Begay, who work closely with us from IEI. Next slide. And I've definitely been working closely with our communities to also ensure that their cultural knowledge systems, their perspectives on the way they see the world is also acknowledged and represented within our programs. One of the best ways that I've ever heard traditional ecological knowledge be defined is by Gregory Cajete, who is a doctoral professor emeritus here at the University of New Mexico. In his book called Native Science, he defined traditional ecological knowledge as a system of knowledge and practices that are passed down through generations, deeply rooted in a culture's relationship with the environment and encompassing ecological, spiritual, and relational aspects. And this book, if you haven't heard of it or seen it yet, please grab it. It really defines and puts into words a lot of the ways of life of our Indigenous communities, especially here in the Southwest. I grew up with this kind of information, and you don't learn any of this in college. It is just that deep connection you have with the land and your people. All this information is passed down, whether through storytelling, whether through cultural practices and ceremonies, and the way that we take part in nature, whether it's hunting, harvesting, gathering, and creating art. Tracy mentioned in my introduction that I use natural pigments and plants to make my pottery. That's, one of the ways in which we connect to land. We use natural resources all around us. Everything has a purpose, and we also have that way of life that we are to protect our Mother Earth and all of its inhabitants and all of its resources. And so these paintings I use to kind of help describe that process of our part in the world and how we see the world. And sometimes some of the science that comes our way and to a community, an Indigenous community's way, from institutions and universities, research centers. Some of this information is pretty much common knowledge as well. So the idea of phytoremediation, using plants to filter waterways, or using plants to repurpose land that has become barren, it is already a known topic in some of our communities. And so when it's introduced as a possible way of remediating contaminated waterways, it's something that these communities already know. And so that we just have to connect this back to the cultures and the way that they think, and so that that understanding happens, and that they're able to receive our information. Next slide. And so along with that, just utilizing imagery that reflects and represents these communities, we've been moving forward with our science by creating our conceptual model for the Superfund Center, using these very subjects I just mentioned. Instead of taking, graphs we make in Word or PowerPoint, although this was partially made in PowerPoint, I used an actual painting I made and affixed it to labels for our center and how we all work together. The left portion of our conceptual model describes our community and their concerns for their environment. We work with 4 different communities: Laguna Pueblo, Cameron, Blue Gap, Tachi, and Redwater Pond, all 3 of which are on the Navajo Nation. And just the landscape here in New Mexico can go from being really green to really dusty to really just different kinds of foliage that changes the colors of our landscape. And I really wanted to reflect that when we start communicating with community. Before I joined the program, I saw some of the graphs and charts models that they were using, and they had plants that really had no connection to the community. So this makes it easier for us to really put us and make that sense of place happen, also not just for our community, but of our researchers, so that they know that they are working with living, breathing, actual communities that are living on these lands that we research. And so I'll go ahead and hand it off to Chris to go further into detail of why we do this research.
So the next slide, please. Thank you. So we want to discuss the big picture here, which is that mining risks fall disproportionately on Native people in the West. You can see from this graph that came out of a paper in 2017 by Dr. Lewis and our colleagues at UNM, that the mining legacy in the West covers more than 160,000 abandoned hard rock mines, of which there are more than 10,000 abandoned uranium mines. And those uranium mines, along with vanadium mines, are second only to gold mines in the West in terms of the total number of abandoned mines. And we're concerned about this because of the potential for higher sensitivity to toxicity from exposure to contaminants of concern. And there are both radiological and heavy metal contaminants in these wastes. Native people rely on local resources, including the notion of living waters. They tend to be understudied genetically, epigenetically, and through metabolic differences from the general society, and they're tied to land. And so a lot of times people in these communities who have waste next to them can't move away. They're captive to those exposures. So next slide. And there's a couple of different methods that we've been using, our colleagues have been using to show on a macro basis these risks. And this in the middle here is the Navajo Nation, including its eastern extent in the state of New Mexico. The orange dots are old mines. And the color scheme going into red and dark red indicates high potential for exposures, environmental exposures. And it's not surprising that those areas coincide with the areas of abandoned uranium mines. Next slide. Another map showing the same things, only on this we've indicated how we have moved across the region through our public health studies. The Danette Project was in 20 chapters of the Eastern Agency between 2002 and 2012, and we are still publishing some papers related to those findings. Our group has participated in the Cove livestock tracking studies, and down in Blue Gap Tachi, where there's a wristband study, also livestock tracking. Our Navajo birth cohort study, which arose out of the Danette Project, is Navajo nationwide. We have 3 sites for our Thinking Zinc clinical trial in the Redwater Pond Road area in the Manuelito chapter on the eastern side, on the New Mexico side, and in Blue Gap Tachi. And we're still studying the impacts of past uranium mining discharges on water quality in the Parco River Valley and what is in an area called the New Lands, or Natsiel community, which is strength through planning. The Pueblo of Laguna over here at the end has the largest open pit uranium mine in the U.S. and was in the world. There's another 250 abandoned mines in the Ambrosia Lake Grants Mineral Belt that are not shown on this map. So there's an extensive amount of exposure that goes on for all the people in these communities. Next slide. Mallory mentioned that these are our metals community partners, Pueblo Laguna, Redwater Pond Road, Blue Gap Tachi Chapter, and Cameron Farm Enterprises north of Flagstaff. The commonalities that they're all exposed through chronically to contaminants of concern in the mine waste, water, land, vegetation, livestock. You can see that many of the contaminants of concern at these sites are common across the region. But the sites vary in size from this massive hole in the ground at the Jackpile mine on Laguna to very small mom and pop operations out there toward Cameron and everything in between. But it's the exposures that link these people and their communities. And we have really done a lot of work to help the communities describe their issues in their own words through citizen science applications. Next slide. Uh, from a public health standpoint, and I'm a public health guy, we're concerned that the pace of cleanup of abandoned mines on Navajo and throughout the West leads to increased risks of exposure because so little is being done. It was just in the past month that EPA told us that they have decided that they fully remediated one abandoned uranium mine out of 524. Which was the first time that they had said that in the past 5 to 6 years. They have done a lot of assessments of mine sites. They have published what they call engineering evaluation and cost analyses documents, which are the decision-making documents. It's under the Superfund law, something of akin to an environmental impact statement. These tend to be very voluminous, hundreds and hundreds of pages, highly technical documents. And, the public is given, 30 to 60 days to comment. And it's a very difficult task to overcome. There's been at least $1.7 billion made available to cleaning up the AUMs, according to EPA, through the bankruptcies, settlements with mining companies, and federal contributions. But that's only 40% of the total burden just on Navajo, let alone these areas outside Navajo. There's been 3 congressional hearings, 3 different response plans, including this one on the left side, the 10-year plan. And what we find is that more than half of all the Navajo communities called chapters have 1 to 3 exposure sources, either abandoned mines, contaminated water sources, or contaminated structures. So the exposure profile is pervasive throughout these areas. Next slide. I show this. This is one mine site, the Claim 28 AUM in the Blue Gap Tachi chapter. There's 17 homes adjacent to this site. It is highly radioactive. Some of these gamma rates that we tested on the surface of this mine waste, no one should really be there. And no one is living there, obviously. But these present an ongoing source of contamination and exposure. And when we actually took samples, we found incredibly high concentrations of uranium in the mine waste and vanadium in the mine waste, well above any crustal average and well above any remediation standard. And in fact, looking at this 6,614 ppm concentration in one of the samples of the mine waste, that would have been mined back in the 50s and 60s. That's a high enough concentration. So these sites are replete with a whole range of metal contaminants and radiological constituents. Next slide. To do this work, we have to work with the communities. They, as Mallory has pointed out, they know so much more than we do about the conditions in their community, and this ecological knowledge that they've transferred through air for water and air risks has helped. We would not have discovered a buried spring under this Claim 28 mine waste if not for the knowledge of the local community people. And when we finally found it and tested it, it was grossly contaminated with uranium, radium, and increased iron concentrations, causing a pH, which is essentially acid mine drainage. At the same time, we found that on the surface of these mine sites, including this one, are very small submicron nanoparticles, as we often call them, a material that has been weathered over years. I mean, this mine site was developed in the 50s and into the early mid 60s. It sat unattended with some minor reclamation back in the early 90s. And so these particulates gets resuspended. And in one of the studies that we did with one of our colleagues at UNM, we found that when laboratory mice are dosed with a solution of these mine dusts, they develop cardiopulmonary responses almost immediately. And so there's a toxicity involved in this, and that has led to the publication of a couple of papers that kind of document this, the role of mine sites in air emissions. Next slide. Water's the same thing. We develop risk communication around water quality because water is life, and people in the communities want to know what's in their water, both public water systems, as this first row on the chart shows, and all the way down to private wells and what we call unregulated wells, develop springs, windmills. And if a water source has one or more exceedances of a maximum contaminant level, we give it a red stop sign. For unregulated sources that don't have exceedances of an MCL, a health-based standard, they almost always will have some secondary standards that will have been exceeded. And because they're unregulated and may contain bacteriological contaminants, we can't recommend that those be used for human consumption. They are fine in many cases for livestock consumption, as we show here. Of course, green light is fine. If you are a public water supply, that's good water, usually, not all the time, but good. And livestock, livestock can flourish off of some of these concentrations. And this is another way to show relative risk, going from one water source to the next. Next slide. In here, we try to illustrate one of the principal findings of several of our health studies, and that is proximity to AUMs result in increased risk of chronic diseases, chronic metabolic diseases, especially kidney disease during the mining era, and cardiovascular disease and autoimmunity during the what we call the legacy period after the mines closed. And one of the reasons is that these mine sites are so close to where people live. This is an example here in the Redwater Pond Road area, northeast of Gallup, New Mexico, for the Cavera Church Rock mine, located very close to where people live. Similarly, at Blue Gap, you have numerous families living at the base of that slope where the mine waste have gone down. In the Cameron area, where they're trying to revitalize local agriculture, it's really difficult to do that when there are 35 abandoned mines all stuck together in this little around this little community, from mines that were developed in the 50s and 60s, and there hasn't been mining since then. At Laguna, the village of Pewate sits right next to the Jack Pile mine, and over in one of the communities in eastern Navajo, Mariano Lake, there are at least 20 families that live around an abandoned mine, which was first developed in 72, worked through 86, and is still there, and the people are still there. So once again, we see these the manifestation of these chronic exposures over time. Next slide. The communities have responded to these risks and threats. The Redwater Pond Road community has been particularly active. This is one of our colleagues, Teresita Kiana, and it's important to read what she said in the citizen science poster here. When I was young, our home was between two uranium mines and half a mile away from a uranium mill. These areas did not have fencing that prevented myself or other children from my age from crossing. Playing and exploring was a favorite pastime. My family had a flock of sheep that grazed on these mine sites, and there was never any warning from the companies or the government officials. My entire generation has been affected, and we will never be compensated for our well-being stolen by the corporations. This is a map that shows that it's not just one site; it's three sites, as Terry's comment suggests. One is going to be left there and placed on top of the mill tailings pile. The other one, as we'll talk about shortly, will go to an off-site location. And this is an example of one of the citizen science posters that this community prepared based on a tremendous amount of historic information in their archives. Next slide. This is not to say that there aren't differences in community perceptions about risks. The Redwater Pond Road community, again in this picture here, has really campaigned to have all the uranium waste removed from their community to protect their health, to reduce exposures, to reduce risk. But this is the only one that has now been decided by EPA to be moved to a regional landfill 45 miles away. The problem is that people and communities, Navajo communities along the transportation route, are opposed to the moving of mine waste through their communities. They passed resolutions to that with that position, concerned about potential radiation releases if there should be accidents involving mine waste. The landfill site is actually geotechnically very suited for permanent disposal in engineered facilities. It's an existing landfill serving 3 counties in New Mexico and much of the Navajo Nation. It's very well managed. We've been there numerous times. And one of the important things is that no mine waste would be mixed with the municipal garbage. This project and the decision by EPA is yet 5 to 6 years away from being implemented, though. A lot of permitting that will take place. Next slide. And I just wanted to remind everybody that there's a continuum of remediation alternatives. We have talked in the past about reclamation. Many of you that are in my age group remember the National Academy of Sciences study on national sacrifice areas in coal mining, saying essentially coal surface mines in the West can't be reclaimed because it's too dry. There's not enough water. The next step up is a term that's used in the Superfund program by EPA, which is remediation, remediating or lowering the concentrations of contaminants or sealing contaminants of concern. It's a higher level of protection. The most protective is, of course, restoration, trying to return the land to the way it was, or much the way it was before mining began. And that's consistent with what they call Dene or Navajo fundamental law, but it's also the most expensive of all the alternatives. These are just diagrams at the bottom that show the standard responses to contaminated sites. The vast majority of these mines will have the cap in place with an evapotranspiration cover imposed. This is a thin layer of dirt with plants planted on top of the mine waste. And the theory is that in arid climates, much of the soil moisture in the top 2 to 3 feet of soils would be desiccated, evaporated before it turned into leachate that could result from contact with the mine waste. Over here at the bottom right is what an engineered disposal facility might look like. This is the Crescent Junction site up off of Interstate 70 Northwest Utah that takes the uranium mill tailings from the Moab site on the Colorado River in Moab, Utah. In the meantime, in the median, there are other emerging technologies which are still being experimented with and really aren't ready for prime time at this point in our view. So we're really stuck with, what many people may say are no-win options. The cap in place may fail shortly and have to be done again, or the transportation risks are exigent in removing waste from one site to get it to an engineered facility. Next slide. And along these lines, we had to help people understand the variation in radiation risk. I'm going to ask you to hit the down button and hit it and keep hitting it. I'll just continue to talk. The arrow indicates increasing doses of gamma radiation as you go from the left to the right. Natural background is what we find in soils compared with crustal averages. That's what occurs naturally, we all live with. If you the next slide, the next picture is the mine waste, which is essentially dirt and rocks left over from the mining operation. They do have elevated radiation and heavy metals. The next in the scale is the uranium ore, because the uranium hasn't been taken out yet. Uranium mill tailings are toxic because they have process chemicals, acids, tertiary amines, a number of organic solutions to leach the uranium out of the rock. The two most severe on the radiological scale are transuranic waste and spent fuel from nuclear power plants, both of which have to be remotely handled. And in the case of spent fuel, you don't stand next to them unprotected. They are deadly. So we wanted to make sure that the people understood that on the scheme of things, mine waste is at the lower end of the elevated radiation scale in these at these mine sites. Next slide. And I'm not going to go through this, but I presented to give you an epidemiologist summary of what these health risks look like when we take apart all these studies that we've published over the years and begin to look at the key findings, like proximity, increased risk of kidney disease during the mining area, cardiovascular disease and autoimmunity during the legacy period. We have chronic exposures because people live near these sites for much of their life. And most recently, in our examination of chronic kidney disease, we found that they are associated with exposures to environmental metals, and that hemoglobin A1C is not necessarily a predictor, which tends to suggest that diabetes status is not always the reason that people have chronic kidney disease, that environmental exposures play a role. I'll highlight in our Navajo birth cohort study this line that says 92% of babies with detectable urine uranium at birth are born to mothers who had urine uranium levels greater than national norms. Well, that's the words that we scientists use. And people can examine this, ask us questions later on about it. But I'm going to now turn it back over to Mallory so she can present this same information in the Indigenous context. Mallory, next slide.
Hi, so as Chris just mentioned, we look at that chart. If we were to take that to community, a lot of that would go over their heads. What does this mean? What can I actually do with the information you gave me? And or simply, what are you talking about? Like, we don't understand some of that, terminology. Of course, the charts could be a little complex to understand. And so we've been using since about 2017 when I joined the team, I've been utilizing artwork and other cultural symbology to help translate that, that information. And so going along with what Chris had mentioned about the 92% of babies having that detectable level of uranium, how do we begin talking about this? So in a lot of the communities we work in, bringing negative news, bringing doom and gloom to a community to talk about death and dying or chronic illnesses is taboo. We don't begin discussions in that manner. Instead, we begin dialogue. We start talking with the community to inform them on our research and ask these questions of them, get their input of, what are their concerns? And a lot of the time, they are very concerned. It is an Indigenous thought process to always consider your ancestors and those who came before you, but also to think ahead of our future generations. And so they understand they have that idea that these mines will have been here and will continue to contaminate the lands. And so they have questions about their children. They have questions about the future generation. And so we can go into depth about, you know, placental transfer on this painting that I created, but that wasn't the only reason this painting was created. It was to also help the community address policy change, and to also to teach researchers and providers that come from outside into their lands and to conduct research in an appropriate manners, in a respectful way, in both Pueblo and Navajo communities. When a baby's born and their umbilical cord falls off, that umbilical cord is returned to the land through ceremony, and each community does it in their own way. But the one thing that is similar is that it can happen anywhere, and it can happen on any place on the land. And so when we go in as environmental scientists and we want to take samples of rock and dirt in places that kind of look a little insignificant, we ask that you harvest and sample with respect, because these ceremonies happen everywhere, all over our lands. And so we are tied to the land in an umbilical fashion, to where we know that we will return to the earth one day. Why would we want to return to an earth that's contaminated? And why would we endanger, you know, our future children for in this manner? And so we ask, you know, to collect with respect, and we then continue this direct, multi-directional form of communication to those that work with these communities. And just for the Navajo birth cohorts study, these are the types of informational graphics that I've been creating. We have a van that is decorated to be more welcoming and to allow for our staff, who are all Navajo, that are doing the collections of specimen, to greet the community and the families that participate in this study. Next slide. And with our other studies, Thinking Zinc, those findings there, taking a look at whether or not zinc, you know, your average recommended dosage of zinc supplements could potentially reduce the amount of uranium being absorbed into the body. This is a very unique study in that this entirety of you know, us introducing this study and recruiting participants, this entire presentation can be done in the Navajo language. And it is amazing to watch our community liaison and educator, Sarah Henyo Edekai, do this entirely in Navajo. You know, the words that they had to think of to make, you know, up the word zinc came from the Navajo code talkers for the word zinc. And so using this art series to talk about, you know, why is it important for zinc to be added to your as a supplement, and what happens when uranium does come into contact with our cells, and what it does to DNA damage, DNA repair. Paintings kind of illustrate when zinc gets involved, there's repair that happens and it restores that balance. And again, Indigenous communities think of everything as a balance. If you're sick, there's an imbalance somewhere, you know, and so our ceremonies are always bringing that balance back, and that those ceremonies address all parts of your life, spiritual, mental, physical well-being. And so that painting on the right end there depicts all of that for something that we can't really physically see with the naked eye. Just like our immune system, we really need a microscope to go way in to see exactly how our B cells and T cells are functioning. This painting uses instead our spiritual ways of guarding and protecting ourselves as a way to show the immune system. Next slide. The next studies that we do within our Metals Superfund Center, majority are environmental studies, and the way we do report back recently that we've just started implementing this is creating research cards to go along with our poster sessions. Posters could be really heavy and technical. We recently did a symposium in Laguna Pueblo, And we had our trainees present their work and their science, and we met with them prior to the event by going over their posters and making lay versions of their research, ensuring that they're using more photos, more art, more something that'll draw the attention and relate to the community, and using smaller words, something along the lines of what a middle schooler would be able to read. And each presenter also had a card kind of summarizing their science, the project goal, what is their principal finding, and definitely what does this mean to your community? How does this science connect to you? And another great thing is, what can you do with this data? What can the community do with our data that we collect with our research? And so we teach how to cite this work, so that our communities can take this and advocate, and many of them do. There's a lot of grassroots programs that have been asking for our science, and to be taught how do we use your science when we go and we talk to legislatures and policymakers and even their own tribal councils. And so we use different arts, and I'm trying to implement this with our trainees or the next generation of researchers, to make this a habit, to make this a part of practice, to ensure that you're able to communicate your science that you're doing your thesis or dissertation on, of course, to your program and your fellow scientists, but also to the community that you use samples to do your research on. Next slide. And so I was fortunate to get a pilot funding project from our P50 Center, the Center for Environmental Health Research, here also under CEHP, to try to find ways to get these groups of people together. And so I got together an undergraduate, a near peer mentor, which is a graduate student, a doctoral student, or one of our staff members that are doing research. And so we got them together. We held sessions with local artists and with community knowledge holders to come together to create material to communicate the science that we're doing. And it was a very successful event. We had so many creative people come together and create, whether it was, 2D pieces like paintings or digital arts, to communicate their science, or, we had a storyteller, we had poets, we had musicians, we had sculptors, and what I found really amazing about this is that everyone included some kind of a environmental justice issue on it, to ensure that these community stories are also told, and that, not just addressing for this Whispers of the Wind drawing here done by one of our trainees and our students, not just addressing where these particulate matter, these dust particles come from. It's not necessarily only coming from the mine, but being in close proximity to an interstate, to train tracks, to possible smelting sources and other power plants nearby, just to announce that, but to also give in the center picture there that the idea of resilience, and how the community has always been strong and steadfast in protecting these lands that they're on, and giving, as we have mentioned before, giving that positivity and that empowerment to the people. And so I'm hoping that this type of communication is able to move forward in our center, and that we're able to meet more with community and take their concerns, so that we are all, able to speak on both sides of the spectrum on where we work our science and our community. And yeah, Chris, if there's anything else you want to add, otherwise I think that was the end of our slides.
Yeah, the next slide, just once again to acknowledge all the folks that you see on this slide here through our Metal Center, our Birth Cohort Study, our Danette Project, all the communities that we work with. This it's a tremendous amount of research that gets done, and we're as Mallory has alluded to, we're learning every day. Those of us from the outside world, trained in Western science, are learning the Indigenous perspectives. We have numerous webinars and in-person visits that we bring community members into Albuquerque to go to UNM to see some of the facilities, and we take researchers out to the communities so that they listen and learn from the community members. So this is a hallmark of this work. And on the very last slide, our contact information. We'd invite anybody to give us a shout out on email, and we'd be happy to follow up. And so thank you very much to Western Washington University and your toxicological series. I didn't know we were going to be the last one, so we're honored to be the last one.
Well, thank you so much, Chris and Mallory. You guys have just been super, and the pacing and the content was marvelous. There's several questions spooled up. One real basic one that somebody asked, and I actually didn't know the answer. You talked about the seepage. So this is a sort of a technical detail question. You talked about the seepage from some of these mine wastes and how they contaminate the groundwater or the surface waters. Is there any contamination of the aquifers or of the water table of deeper down water from some of these activities? Do we know that?
We don't know enough about it. In a lot of the mine sites that EPA has jurisdiction over under the Superfund law, they have deferred discussion and investigation of groundwater impacts because they want to get the surface risks dealt with first. There are notable exceptions to that. Almost all of the uranium mill tailing sites in the Southwest and the West have groundwater contamination that has, it's kind of being taken care of, but it's really not. That's a lot of passive remediation, meaning humans aren't doing anything to enhance the ability of the groundwater to recover. But still, more work needs to be done, especially around the mine sites.
Okay. Yeah. In our first year of this seminar series, we had two presentations representing the issues that the Navajo Nation faces as a result of a lot of these mining activities. And it's just, when you see this again, it's hard to watch, hard to look at, hard to see. You started talking about you led off with a difference and a real nice summary between Indigenous knowledge and sort of the Western approach to science. And I thought that was really well done. I think my experience has been that Western science is trying to encompass Indigenous approaches and traditional ecological knowledge. We have a long way to go, obviously, but I think that speaking for the Western science community, I think we're realizing that the linear approach and total objectivity, while it's valued for certain purposes, it's not going to get us to where we need to go in terms of understanding truly how we're going to manage this world. And a question, and maybe it might be a dumb question, it's coming from me. Are there examples or are there approaches where Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous approaches to knowledge have been or could be used in some of the legal proceedings that we're so often ruled by in trying to resolve these issues?
Mallory, you want to take that?
Well, there's been examples outside of the communities we work in, actually within right now. I mean, it is a threatened issue right now with the Mount Taylor. 5 tribal communities, tribal nations have come together to name Mount Taylor a sacred site. And sometimes our sacred sites are protected and sometimes they're not. We are always on the roller coaster on what we can justify to legislation. And a lot of what we're seeing, especially in the communities that are still living off the land, that are still harvesting and hunting these lands that could potentially be contaminated, is that threat to human health. And we're just now getting started with human studies in Laguna Pueblo. That was kind of a shortfall on our ends to provide that proof that there is toxicity occurring in humans or in community, because those studies had not yet occurred due to cultural protections, cultural protocols, the belief that, you know, giving up samples of themselves it goes against their systems, and just wanting to wait until there were further protections. And of course, having representation within science. We have a lot of Indigenous scientists that work with us now that we're building that trust. And so with the Landwise, we're able to utilize and prove that we do still collect, hunt, harvest, and farm on these lands. And we still pray just the way you go to a church. We still have those ceremonies within different parts of the land, in our heritage sites. But there's areas in which we still further have to elude and prove that we're utilizing these resources, and or, you know, it's hard for us because a lot of this is esoteric knowledge. And even within our systems, our tribal communities, these knowledge systems are only on a need to know basis. Our medicine people, our Kiva leaders are the only ones that should have this knowledge. And so sometimes there's times where we cannot divulge too much information. And so it's a really thin line when we're trying to work with, you know, institutions to not overshare and to also still keep our, you know, integrity and then our community's culture that have been, you know, forcibly taken away at one point in our history, and we're still guarded. And sometimes on a personal note, I see that, you know, that will, you know, it's helping keep our cultures alive. And also, we had in one of these communities tell us when we were suggesting a research study, to make sure that we're checking the actual plants that they still utilize. So we were corrected, please check the tea, the wild celery, the wild onions. And you can find them here. Go check on that, please. Versus us saying, oh, well, this area is, you know, contaminated. Let's check that plant right there. And it might not have any significance to the community. So it's always great to hear community involvement and say, like, no, we'd rather have you check this because we still utilize it. We don't have to tell you how we utilize it, but we want you to know that it's still used.
Great. Yeah, the differences, you know, in what we have to do as, you know, exercising the Western science to get it used in a legal proceeding is sometimes it's so rigid and ineffective. We need to find ways to make our total sum of knowledge more effective, and I think some Indigenous approaches will help. You talked a bit about citizen science. We don't have too much time, but I was curious and you gave some examples of people when you said citizen science doing presentations about what was important to them. Are there other examples of citizen science where people are actually just what types of citizen science are most effective from the standpoint of both informing the work you're doing as well as engaging the communities? And that's probably too open-ended of a question to get done in the next 2 minutes, but I'm just curious.
Well, I would say that in several of these projects, if we didn't have local knowledge, we wouldn't have found contaminated springs. We wouldn't have identified submicron particles on weathered uranium wastes. I think that over the years we put into the hands of community people radiation detection instruments and taught them how to use them. We've engaged in seminars and web in-field demonstrations on collecting soil samples and doing it correctly, water samples and doing it correctly. So these are all ways for people in the communities to participate in the research that they really asked for. I mean, we're responding to the concerns of the community, in addition, of course, to the community members being participants in the various studies. So, you know, citizen science is somewhat of a stepchild on the Western side of things, but the more we do it, the more we engage the communities, the more robust it becomes. So we have several examples that we could share later on, but it pulls people closer to the research that's been going on.
Yeah, great. And so we're running out of time. Again, you folks were a great capstone to what we've been doing for the last 5 years. We really appreciate your coming and sharing your knowledge and your information with us. And Ruth, do you have any last words for 5 years of a long run? And thank you again so much. We really appreciate it.
I really want to thank Western, the alumni office and Institute for Environmental Toxicology for helping us with all this over the years. And just thank you to everybody who's been here. Tracy, it's been great working with you.
Yep, bittersweet.
Yep.
Take care. Thanks again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.